Can you describe to us what level of narcotics distribution Mr. Davis had? Yeah, he was at the highest level there is. I mean, he trafficked drugs across the United States. How do I know this? Because in our gang unit, we only really dealt with shootings and murders, so we didn't have the manpower or the time to deal with someone like Keefe at this level. So during my time in the gang unit, we were contacted by several agencies like the FBI and the DEA who wanted intelligence on Mr. Keefe D, and they told us that he was trafficking narcotics across the country and they were going to investigate it. Is it fair to say in 1997, you guys executed another search warrant on Mr. Davis's residence? Yes. And then in that 1997 residence, did you find a ceased bill or request of payment from the Monte Carlo Hotel? Yes. The Monte Carlo Hotel here in Vegas? Yes. And what was the reason that you seized that? Because it was relevant to the Tupac investigation? Yes. Now, this section of the grand jury transcript, we actually hear from the Complon Police, and they give a real lowdown on Keefe D. They say Keefe D was one of the biggest drug traffickers in California, period, and he was running drugs to New York. This same person that he was running drugs to New York was the same one who provided the weapon to shoot Pac. So it's crazy. Make sure you watch the whole video. It's around 30 minutes. I cut all of the parts out. It also gives an insight on the gang life. It also gives insight on Keefe D's nephew, Orlando Anderson, how he had a rise to fame as far as the gang life go. It also talks about Tupac's alleged killer, Big Dre, how he was actually facing some other bodies in Compton before he passed away. So it's a lot. Make sure you watch the video. Thumbs it up. Let's get into it. Now, good morning, sir. Are you currently employed? No, I'm retired. What are you retired from? I was a police officer for 32 years. Can you tell us about your employment history? Yes. I was hired full-time by the city of Compton in 1983. Compton is like a 10 square mile city, and it has a population of about 100,000 people. And when I first started in 1983, there wasn't one residential area that wasn't claimed by the Crips or Bloods when I first started. I spent 5 years in patrol, and during this time, this is basically my introduction to the Crips and Bloods, because basically most of the activity and our radio calls were based around gang activity at the time. So I learned a lot about, the way they dressed, the territories that they claim, and I did this for 5 years until I was promoted to the gang unit in 1988. Now, my duties as a gang officer were to photograph and identify gang members, gather intelligence, and basically investigate all gang-related crimes. Now, when I first got into the gang unit in 1988, Compton was a very violent city. We were averaging in this little small town 70 to 80 homicides a year and hundreds of shootings going on at the time between the Crips and the Bloods. So what I did was I went out on a daily basis and contacted gang members. When I arrested them, I would speak to them, and I would go out in the streets and I would talk to them on a casual basis too. And I saw the same people over and over again because it was such a small city. So I got to know all the gang members, each territory. We had over 55 active gangs at the time in this 10 little square mile city. So I did this until 1993 when I was promoted to gang homicide detective. I was there until the year 2000. So I spent 12 straight years in the gang unit in Compton, and during this time I handled hundreds of homicide cases, thousands of shootings, and basically I got to know the way the gang members talk, the way they think, the way they act, basically their overall mentality about gang life in general. Also during this time, I testified in excess of 100 times as a gang expert in criminal court system. From 2001 to 2013, I left Compton and went to a different agency in Garden Grove, and I was there for 13 years, from 2001 until 2010. I spent a lot of time teaching about Crips and Bloods at gang seminars, some very big prestigious ones. One was right here in Las Vegas called No Gangs, where 1,000 officers from around the country and around the world would show up to learn about Crips and Bloods. I also did this in California many times too. And the same thing, thousands of officers came to learn about Crips and Bloods from all over the country and all over the world, basically. So I was a police officer for 32 years, so about 25 to 26 of them I spent in the gang unit. So they wanted to know, they said, is it fair to say when it comes to Crips and Bloods, particularly in Compton, are you one of the, and particularly from the mid-90s, and maybe your partner, Tim Brennan, were the predominant experts in this particular area? Yes. All right, and I'm going to ask you about some of the 90s gangs in Compton. Okay, you mentioned Crips and Bloods. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Crips in Compton? Yeah, well, by the time I got there in 1983, All of the neighborhoods were already set. You know, the Crips originated in the early 70s and started in South Central Los Angeles. And they identified themselves by wearing the color blue and called themselves Crips. Well, these guys moved from South Central to Compton, and they started to claim territories around Compton. Okay, so they start working their way up north. Okay. So there's a group of people in the north side of our city. They lived on Piru Street and went to high school called Centennial High, and their colors were red. I talked to the guys that basically started the Pirus, and they lived on Piru Street in Compton. So basically, to combat the Crips, they just wanted to be different with their colors. So they were red, so they adopted the color red and called themselves West Side Pirus. The Pirus obviously identified themselves by wearing red, and they spread across the north side of the cities into Los Angeles. So basically, if you're a Piru, all of the gangs in Compton, they're like West Side Piru, Lauders Park Piru, they all end in Piru Street. So if you're in Los Angeles and they're all end with blood, like Bounty Hunter Bloods, for instance, is a gang in LA. So if you're from Compton, you're a Piru. If you're in LA, you're a Blood, you still wear red and you still claim blood. And then we'll go with the Crips. Tell us about the beginning of the Crips and what colors they identify and the kind of areas in Compton they claim. Yeah, like I said, they basically started in South Central in the early 70s and they moved into Compton on the south side of the city. Most of the Pirus are on the north side of the city and most of the Crips are on the south side of Compton. So they started coming in the early 70s. They claimed most of the south side of Compton and identified themselves by wearing the color blue. Is it fair to say that the Bloods and the Crips have rivalries over territory or other explicit activity? Definitely. Just because one red and one blue don't like each other. They had an ongoing feud between these guys and it started from the beginning. So then they asked this question. They said, in understanding gangs, can you tell us a little bit about the structure of the gang? In particular, what work somebody has to put in to move up in the gang? He answers yes. Basically, 3 portions of a gangster's life. They start out from the ages of 12 to 16 and they're called BGs or baby gangsters. This is the beginning of a gangster's life, basically, and he spins. He doesn't have any respect at this point because he's just learning how to be a gangster. So he's in the neighborhood, he's guarding the territory, he's guarding the neighborhood, he's spraying painting on the walls, he's doing low-level stuff, protecting the neighborhood and selling narcotics for the older gangsters. So from the age of about 16 to 24, you get in the next phase, and this is called a gangster phase. And this is where guys earn their most of the respect because this is where the most violent crime occurs. These guys start earning their stripes, as we call it, in the streets by doing different drive-bys. They're fighting, they're doing robberies, they're fighting with the police. So basically, the more violent crime, the more respect you get amongst the gang members. Get respect from outside of other gangs also, but if you're known as a shooter, someone who's violent, and other gangs are afraid. So they give you the respect. Hey, these guys are killers, so don't mess with them. So by the time you're 24, 25, you enter the next phase. Most of these guys during the violent phase, gangster phase, end up in prison, go to jail, they do their time, they put in their work in the neighborhood, have the respect of their peers. So they get out of jail and they move up and they're called older gangsters. So these guys, that's the ultimate respect. They can become shot callers because they put in the time, they put in the work for the gang, and they tell the young gangsters to do it. They listen to them without hesitation because if the younger gangsters don't listen to them, something's bad going to happen. So the shot callers or the OGs, they're the ones instructing the soldiers or the gangsters what to do. That's correct. You mentioned this a little bit, but I want to develop it a little bit more. You're a soldier and you're told what to do by an OG, or you're told not what to do by an OG. And if you disobey, are there consequences? He answers definitely. And what type of consequences may the soldier face? We've had anything from getting beat down by fellow gangsters all the way up to murder. So now I want to focus a little bit on the Southside Crips. Specifically, are you aware of a group called the Southside Compton Crips? Yes, sir. Were they also just called the Southside Crips? And when you say Southside Compton Crips and Southside Crips, are you talking about the same crew? Yes. Do they have a particular territory in Compton? Yes. They're one of our larger gangs and they're located in the southeast portion of Compton. Do they have any particular colors that they wear or any type of customs that are specific to the Southside Crips? It says yes, they identify themselves by wearing blue. So if you contact a Southside Crip gang member, they'll have some type of blue on them. Blue shoelaces, blue bandana, a blue belt, anything blue. They wear blue hats. They adopted the Seattle Mariners hat because it has an S on it. It was a blue hat with the S on it, so it stood for Southside Crips. Now, we're probably over 100 active gang members documented with the Southside Crips. and I guess they're one of our most notorious gangs. I investigated every crime imaginable, all the way up to the possession of firearms, the possession of assault rifles and sales of narcotics to robbery and murder. So would it be fair to say that one of the common activities of the Southside Crips, as you mentioned, to commit narcotic transactions, weapon discharges, murders, beatdowns, robberies, etc.? Yes, sir. You mentioned shooters before. Is there a way that something that shooters sometimes have to go through from BG status to soldier status? Well, like I said, most of them become gangster because they do the most violent crimes. So you're going to be your shooters and the guys that go and drive-by shootings and commit robberies and so on. Are you familiar? I'm going to show you what's marked as state or grand jury's exhibit number 3. Are you familiar with somebody by the name of Orlando Anderson? Yes, we're pulling up number 3. I'm displaying grand jury record exhibit number 3 on the monitor. Do you recognize this person? He says, yes, that's Orlando Anderson. In your time working with gangs in Compton in the 90s, did you become familiar with Mr. Anderson? Yes, he says, how so? I'm very familiar with Orlando Anderson. I've seen him many a times in the Southside Crip neighborhood and other places also. He also admitted to me that his nickname, he goes by Baby Lane. He's admitted that he's a Southside Crip member. When I would see him, he would also be in company with other Southside gang members. And I guess you could say I was there for the initiation into the gang. Me and my partner were coming out of a fast food restaurant just adjacent to their territory, and Orlando and 2 other Southside Crips were waiting for us to come out in the bushes, and they opened fire. Shot at us. And so, like I say, I watched him grow up in the neighborhood. And in my book, he's definitely a hardcore gangster because at the time of Tupac's shooting, we had already been investigating him on 2 other prior murders, gang-related murders in the city of Compton. So with regards to Mr. Anderson, were you aware of him being a shooter and his status within the Southside Crips? Yes, sir. I want to ask you about a guy named DeAndre Smith. That will be a grand jury exhibit number 4. Do you recognize this person depicted in grand jury exhibit number 4? Yes, that's DeAndre Smith. And how do you know Mr. Smith? Again, during my time in the streets of Compton, I had dealings with him many times. He admitted to me that his nickname was Big Dre. He admitted that he was a Southside Crip gang member and he was always in company of other Southside Crip gang members. You mentioned that during the mid-90s, you were aware that Mr. Anderson was in the soldier phase of his gangster evolution. Is that right? That's correct. Where was Mr. Smith in this phase of the gangster status? He was the same as Orlando. As a matter of fact, they were friends. I would see them 2 together all the time. I'm going to show you now grand jury number 5. Okay, before we get to grand jury number 5, you had mentioned that you investigated Mr. Anderson regarding murder or 2 prior to the incident out here in Las Vegas. Is that correct? Yes. And was Mr. Smith involved in any of those activities? Yes, he was involved in one incident with Mr. Orlando Anderson where he supposedly killed somebody at a party over an argument. So is it fair to say that this helps inform that they were both active gang members and the level of their status of the Southside Crips? Yes, sir. Now I'm going to show you grand jury exhibit number 5. Do you recognize this person depicted? Yes, that's Terry Brown or Terrence Brown. And did he have a nickname? Yeah, they called him Bubble Up. Now, how did you know Mr. Brown? I would see him many times. He admitted to me his nickname was Bubble Up. He admitted that he was a Southside Crip member. And when I saw him, he always was in the company of other Southside Crip gang members. I would put him in the gangster hardcore phrase as well. He was arrested, I know, for drugs and weapon violation. Now, you mentioned that before that you had talked with a lot of people, both in custody and out of custody. And now you're talking about these gangsters, talking to you about, their nicknames and admitting what gangs they were in. As somebody who did, so many years in the gang unit in Compton, do you have an explanation on why people would talk to you or to your partners as to what they were doing, who they were in the neighborhood? And he said, yeah, Troll, we let Patrol be the bad guy. So if you're hanging out drinking and shooting dice over the corner or whatever, Patrol would come over and shoot them off. So they didn't like the Patrol. So when we would come in the gang unit, we took a different approach because we needed to gather intelligence as to who was fighting who's the main players, and what their nicknames was. So when we contacted them, it was more on a casual basis. Unless we saw them commit a crime or something, we would have to deal with it. So we go out, we wore jeans, t-shirts that said police on it, and we had an unmarked car. So they knew who we were. Of course, we would go out there more on a casual basis and contact these guys and talk to them. And is it fair to say that even some of these hardcore gangsters would be able to have a normal, casual, civilized conversation with them? Yes, because over the years we would build rapport with these guys. I mean, they knew us and we knew them, and they knew if they crossed the line we could arrest them, but we weren't going to sweat them on small stuff, so they talked to us. Is it fair to say that you and your partner had within a 10 square miles of Compton as gang detectives? Definitely. And who was your partner at the time? Tim Brennan. Did he have a nickname? Yeah, all the gangsters called him Blondie because he had blonde hair and blue eyes. But wasn't Mr. Brennan actually featured on one or more songs in reference to Blondie? Yes. Now I'm going to refer attention to Grand Jury Exhibit number 2. Do you guys recognize this person in Grand Jury Exhibit number 2? Yes, that's Keefe Dwayne Davis. And were you aware of any nickname he went by? Yeah, they called him Keefe D. And did you have any interactions with Mr. Davis? I had many interactions with Mr. Davis throughout my years in Compton. He admitted to me that his name was Keefe D, and I basically used to chase him around. He used to sell drugs on the street when he was a young kid, and I watched him grow up to be one of the biggest narcotics dealers in Compton. Now, we talked about the structure from baby G's to gangsters to OGs. In the mid-90s, where was Mr. Davis? He was definitely a shot caller. He ran, and it was a faction. Southside Crips used to be one big happy family, but they had an internal feud, and they split up into fractions, and Keefe D ran. They called him the Burr Street Kangaroo, and he was definitely the leader. Now, in the Burr Street crew, would that include Orlando Anderson? Yes. Would that include DeAndre Smith? Yes. Would that include Terrence Brown? Yes. And we talked earlier about the people with various roles within the gang. So if Mr. Davis is an OG/shot caller, is it your expert opinion that Mr. Davis, that Mr. Anderson, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Brown would be required to follow orders of Mr. Davis? Yes. Now, is it also to your opinion, if Mr. Davis told them not to do something, would they not do it? Yes. So when you're talking about generally a violent act, in your expert opinion, would either Mr. Anderson, Mr. Smith, or Mr. Brown shoot somebody without the express statement of Mr. Davis to shoot them? If he was there with them and he ran the show, they would have to do what he said. So if he wasn't there, they might have done something on their own, correct. But if he's there with them, they're not shooting anybody unless Mr. Davis is going to give the green light. That's correct. So he was literally a shot caller, without a doubt. I want to ask you something I kind of skipped over before, and I meant to go back, no problem. Now, how important is respect in gang culture? Now, it's huge. These guys live their lives based on respect. They demand it. And like I said, they have to earn respect. So the more the violent they are, the more crazy they are, the more respect they get. Now, tell me about disrespect. How is it viewed within the gang culture? Now, disrespect and retaliation, to me, go hand in hand. Disrespect of these guys, I'm going to try to find the words here. Hold on, let me see. Based on thousands of crimes that I've committed, I'd say 90% of them are a result of disrespect within the gang culture. Now, an example of this would be gangsters walking down the street. A rival gang shows up in a car. Say there's 5 of them in a car. They jump down and beat this gangster down. Well, he's got to go back to the neighborhood and say, hey, these guys came over, they disrespected me, they beat me down. We got to go retaliate, because if you disrespect one gangster, you would disrespect all. Another example would be a carload comes to your neighborhood and they do a drive-by. They shoot one of your homies, as they say. Hey, they came to our neighborhood, they shot one of our homies, they totally disrespected us, we gotta go retaliate. So it's kind of like a revolving door with these guys with the disrespect and retaliation. I think you misspoke. You said thousands of crimes you committed. I think you meant thousands of crimes you investigated. He says, yeah, that, investigated, I'm sorry. All right, now I want you to turn your attention to a group called the Mob Paru. Are you familiar with them? Yes. And can you tell us a little bit about the Mob Paru? Yes, they're located in the northeast portion of the city, so they're probably about a mile away from the Southside Crips where it starts. They're a mile apart. They're a smaller gang, and their territory is probably a quarter mile in each direction. These guys originated in 1975/76, and they were an offshoot of one of the largest gangs called the Launders Park Paru. Now, these group of the next generation, they wanted their own territory and their own area as they started the Mob Paru, which stands for Members of the Bloods. Now, these guys were probably 35 to 45 active Mob Paru gang members. And again, during my time in Compton, I investigated every type of crime imaginable with these guys, all the way up to the possession of firearms and sales of narcotics, all the way to robbery and murder. And I think I skipped too far with the regards of Keefe D, who depicted right here on Grand Jury number 2. You mentioned that you had information through your investigation that Mr. Davis was a big-time drug dealer. Can you describe to us what level of narcotics distribution Mr. Davis had? Yeah, he was at the highest level there is. I mean, he trafficked drugs across the United States. How do I know this? Because in our gang unit, we only really dealt with shootings and murders, so we didn't have the manpower or the time to deal with someone like Keefe at this level. So during my time in the gang unit, we were contacted by several agencies like the FBI and the DEA who wanted intelligence on Mr. Keefe D, and they told us that he was trafficking narcotics across the country and they were going to investigate it. He was also arrested for trafficking narcotics too in his past. In the terms of how that, and what places him in the ranking of the gang, to somebody who can generate revenue through the sales of narcotics, especially at that level, does that elevate him within the structure of the gang? Yes. What is the revenue basis for people to purchase firearms? Do they have any things that associate with the gang life? Now, he says every gang member in Compton, the sales of narcotics is their lifeline. Most of them do not work. They sell drugs to pay their rent. They sell drugs to buy weapons and more drugs to buy cars. It's their lifeline to the gang, really. If it's fair to say, at least in the mid-90s, Mr. Davis was a person providing a lifeline to this group of the Southside Compton Crips. Definitely. And then I'm going to show you Grand Jury Exhibit number 7. Do you recognize the person depicted in this? He says, yes. I don't know his real name. I only know him as Zip. And did he have any connection to Mr. Davis that you became aware of in your course of investigation and his involvement investigating the Southside Compton Crips? Yes, we were told that this guy Zip was his connection on the East Coast in New York. So is it fair to say that Mr. Davis, when you say Mr. Davis was supplying narcotics to the nation, is it fair to say that this person depicted in Grand Jury Exhibit number 7, Zip, was one of the people he was doing it with, transacting narcotics to the East Coast? That's correct. Going back to the Mob Paru, were you aware or not in the mid-90s, Mob Paru had an association with a record label? So these guys were associated with Death Row Records and Suge Knight. Suge Knight grew up in the Mob Paru territory. He wasn't a gang member. He lived in the neighborhood, so he knew all these guys. So when he started the label Death Row Records, he hired these guys from the Paru mob to be his bodyguards and his entourage. So I want to talk to you about these people that Suge Knight had working for him as security during the mid-90s. Can you show Grand Jury Exhibit number 6? Do you recognize this person depicted in Grand Jury number 6? He says, yes, that's Trayvon Lane. Mr. Lane, did he have an association with the Mob Paru? Yes, again, I had many contacts with him over the years. They called him Trey. He admitted to me that he was a Mob Paru gang member. He was always with other Mob Paru gang members, and he was one of Suge Knight's bodyguards. To me, being a gang expert, Suge Knight wasn't going to hire, somebody that wasn't tough or hardcore enough to be his bodyguard and defend him. So these guys were hardcore gang members. Now, did you know anybody that went by the name of Neckbone? He says, yes, that's Roger Williams, yes. Did Mr. Roger Williams have any association with Mob Paru? Yes, he was a Mob Paru gangster, and his nickname was Neckbone, and he was also Suge Knight's bodyguard. Do you know anybody that went by the name of Buntree? Yes, Buntree is Alton McDonald. Again, he was Suge Knight's bodyguard, a known Paru member. And he was somebody that you also would consider a hardcore gangster. Then did you know anybody who went by the name of Mob James? That's James McDonald. He was also probably the OG saddest. He's an older gangster, but he definitely claimed Mob Paru. And was he associated at all with Death Row Records to your knowledge? He was also one of their bodyguards. So it's fair to say that given the hardcore gangsters that Mr. Knight was surrounding himself with, Mob Paru was deeply associated with Death Row Records, yes. Did you become aware of the incident at the Lakewood Mall involving a Death Row chain? He says yes. And can you tell us about it? Yes. Now, after Tupac was shot here in Las Vegas, we found out that incident happened prior to the shooting at a Lakewood Mall, which was 5 to 10 miles away from Compton. Some guys would go to Foot Locker and get their shoes because there's no place in Compton except for a swap meet to get tennis shoes. So they all went to the Lakewood Mall to the Foot Locker. Trayvon Lane was with a couple of his buddies, and he had on his death row necklace that Suge gave them. And he was confronted by Orlando Anderson, about 5 to 6 other Southside Crip gang members, and they tried to take Trayvon Lane's death row chain. They beat him down. They beat Trayvon down at the Lakewood Mall. And relevant to your gang expertise, with something like that, would there be a consequence for an incident like that? Well, like I said, Trayvon Lane is going to go back. He's going back to his group, the Mob Piru and Suge Knight, and he's going to tell them what happened. And he's going to tell them these Southside Crips disrespect him. They beat him up. They tried to take my chain. So there would be some type of retaliation for that. And now I'm going to show you as Grand Jury Exhibit number 41. Do you guys recognize what is depicted in Grand Jury number 41? Yes, what is that? That's a death row chain or necklace that Suge Knight gave his entourage. And I became aware of that in 1995 for a Christmas present. Suge Knight gave his 4 or 5 of his entourage that names that we just said, Buntry, Trey, Neckbone, gave them all real nice necklaces. He also gave one of these to the head of security, Reggie Wright Jr. He gave these necklaces for Christmas presents. He only gave them out to a few at a time, and it was a very prestigious to these gang members to wear, and when they wore it, it was like a badge of honor. It is relevant to your expertise that Trayvon Lane not only received the beatdown, he had a very prestigious item taken from him by the Southside Crips. Yes. And it will further escalate the need for retaliation for Mob Piru. I don't know if it further escalated it, but it definitely would. They would definitely have some type of retaliation for that. They did. Are you aware of the shooting that occurred here September 6, 1996? Yes. And how did you become aware of the shooting? Well, I was at home when I received a call from my boss, Reggie Wright Sr. Now Reggie Wright Jr., he was the head of security for Suge Knight, and his dad was our boss. So after the Tupac shooting, he called his father and told him, hey, Tupac and Suge was just shot, and they're saying it was Southside Crips. So in turn, Reggie Wright Sr. called us and said, hey, Suge Knight just got shot. Tupac also got shot. He's in critical condition. They're saying it's Southside Crips, so get ready. It's coming back to Compton. Why would it be relative for people in Compton if the shooting happened all the way in Las Vegas? Well, because we're going to have a war as a result of this, because these guys were 2 of the biggest hip hop stars, plus one had Mob Piru, their entourage, and they were going to retaliate against these guys for shooting Tupac and Suge Knight. So when the war started in Compton, it kind of just, to me as a gang expert, we were getting from Las Vegas was true. Now, you mentioned a war started. Can you tell us a little bit about the immediate aftermath of the Tupac shooting as it affected Compton? Well, 2 days after Tupac was shot, we had our first drive-by shooting, which was one of the OGs from the Southside Crips. He was shot in the back as he was going into the market. It was a mile away from their territory, but that was the first shooting of many. So the next 10 days, it had been 3 murders, 11 drive-by attempted murder shootings between Mob Piru and the Southside Crips. It happened in the city of Compton, so we had a very violent war going on as the result of something that happened in Las Vegas. So it's fair to say, even for a place as violent as Compton, the violence escalated between the Southside Crips and Mob Piru in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. That's correct, because prior to the shooting of Tupac's, beside them just being normal enemies, their territory just a mile away from each other, we really didn't have anything going on. No shootings between them at the time until after the Tupac shooting. To show you what was previously marked as the Grand Jury Exhibit number 8, in order to help Las Vegas as you figure out what's going on both here in Compton, did you at one point have LAPD or Compton PD officers come here and try to identify people at the MGM? Yes, that's my partner. He went to Las Vegas to assist the Las Vegas with the shooting of Tupac because they had the tape and wanted him to identify some members. And since then, has you had the opportunity to review the tape yourself? Yes. I'm going to ask you if you recognize anybody in this video. Okay, you can pause it here at 18 seconds. It appears that there's a fight or a beating occurring in the middle portion of the video. Is that correct? Yes. Now, can you, if you play it slow or play it a little bit, can you recognize any of these folks involved in this beating? Yes. Who do you recognize? That guy right there in the all white and black hat is Buntry, and he was Alton McDonald. His nickname is Buntry. And he was one of the people you had previously discussed as being a Mob Piru member who was associated with Death Row Records. Yes. Can you pause right here? Oh, I just missed it. Sorry, let me go back. Okay, we're about 27 seconds into the video. Is anybody else that you recognize in this video? The 2 people right there, the guy in the all black. Can I get up? Yes, this guy right here in the all black is Roger Williams or Neckbone. He was one of the Mob Piru bodyguards like I mentioned before, and Suge Knight here in all gray. if we can proceed. We have reviewed this video previously. Were you able to tell who the victim was of the beating? Who was that? He says Orlando Anderson. And that's the same Orlando Anderson who was a hardcore gangster of the Southside Compton Crips. He says that's correct. Would that beating like that be consistent with your understanding of retaliation for an incident that occurred? This incident that occurred at the Lakewood Mall? Definitely. So that's the best I got. Is that person who's taking the beating, that's Orlando? Yes. Can you see Mr. Shakur involved in this video also? It's hard to see. He's in there. I can't. Okay, immediately walking away, do you see Mr. Shakur just ahead of Mr. Knight? Yes, I'm going to show you grand jury exhibit number 42, which the video is playing. Does it appear this video is just after the beating that we just saw? Okay, do you recognize the people that are walking towards the exit of the casino? It's all of the people that were there during the beatdown. And now I want to show you a little bit better view of Mr. Shakur. Yes, that's him in the front. He's in the front of Suge Knight right here. He's in the front of Suge Knight. That's Buntry just took off his hat and Trayvon Lane right behind him. Were you familiar with somebody by the name of Frank Alexander? Yes, he was one of Suge Knight's security guards. He wasn't a gang member. He worked for Reggie Wright Sr. Well, Jr., I'm sorry. Passing it right here. Do you see Mr. Alexander? Yes, he's in the black. He's out front right here. Is it fair to say this video is depicting members of the death row entourage leaving the area of the beating of Mr. Anderson? Yes. Does it appear that they, along with people, were identified with death row or Mob Piru, along with various members of the crowd, leaving the MGM? Yes. You mentioned this war occurred as the result of the Tupac shooting. Did you guys have a nickname for the war that occurred? Was it called the 10-Day War, or am I just making that up? Well, I had said that before. I didn't know if it was a nickname. It's something you referred to. The aftermath of the Tupac shooting, you referred to as a 10-day war. Yes, as a result of these shootings you described, the murders you described occurred between Southside Compton Crips and Mob Piru immediately after the Tupac shooting. By you guys, I mean the Compton Police Department take any action to try to stop this? Yeah, we did. We put together a massive multi-gang search warrant, and we did this for several reasons. First, to send a message that, hey, you're going to stop killing each other. We wanted to put many of them in jail to stop the violence between the two gangs. It also tried to help the LAPD with the investigation of Tupac. We served search warrants on 39 locations on both sides, the Mob Piru and the Southside Crips, and we arrested many of them. Now, among the people's residence that you did a search on, was Orlando's residence one of those? Yes. Was DeAndre Smith's? Yes. Terrence Brown? Yes. Keefe D? Yes. Now, is it fair to say, to your knowledge, no firearm used in the murder of Tupac was recovered? That is correct. Is it fair to say in 1997, you guys executed another search warrant on Mr. Davis's residence? Yes. And then in that 1997 residence, did you find a cease bill or request of payment from the Monte Carlo Hotel? Yes. The Monte Carlo Hotel here in Vegas? Yes. And what was the reason that you seized that? Because it was relevant to the Tupac investigation? Yes. And that will only be relevant to the Tupac investigation because it showed that Mr. Davis was here in Las Vegas during the time of the murder of Tupac Shakur? Yes. Yes, the state has no further questions for this witness. Does the members of the grand jury have any questions for Mr. Ladd?